What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. Well, here we are. We're ready to start our Michel Foucault mini-squared series that we set up for y'all last week with me and Comrade Commissar talking about a basic overview of Michel Foucault's thought, some of his writings, his method, in preparation for diving into the lectures of Society Must Be Defended this week. We're going to keep this one pretty short and sweet just to get right into the content, but as a friendly reminder, if you have not listened to that first episode and you are unfamiliar with Michel Foucault's work, his writing, his theory, I would definitely encourage you to go back and check that out, and it'll just help you get set up for a better experience in diving into the lectures themselves starting this week. As always, please help support Red Library by subscribing on iTunes. Give us one of those quick and easy reviews on iTunes just to help others find the show from around the globe and help us get some more listeners and keep building on the work that we're doing here. If you'd like to support what we're doing on Patreon, head over there. You can just find us under Red Library. Should be pretty easy, and you can help us out on getting to 25 patrons so we can buy some new mics and a cool new mixer, take it into the space age, and get off of this very functional but also very limited free software that we're using, which only allows us to record one guest at a time. Last but not least, like us on Facebook, share the show around to friends and family, co-workers, other radicals, other militants, whoever else you think might benefit or be interested in hearing some of the ideas and theory that we're spitting here on the show. Without further ado, let's get into Lecture 1 of Society Must Be Defended by Michel Foucault, and we'll see you back here afterward. Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Red Library. Thanks for joining us for part 1 of our Michel Foucault.
What, isn't this part 2?
Oh, it is part 2. You're right.
This is part 2 of the first part of the book, though.
Yeah, that's really confusing.
Yeah, I know.
I didn't do a good job at that. I'm not editing this out.
I think our listeners are smart enough to be able to put
That's
together.
right. That's right. I think that's a really good point. We have a lot of faith and hope in our listeners.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that their brains just didn't completely melt down whenever they heard me say that.
Yeah.
Well, now that we worked that out, so this is lecture number 1 of Society Must Be Defended by Michel Foucault. The lecture series from, 1975 through 1976. So we're going to be diving in. If you haven't listened to it already, we really do encourage you to go back and listen to the first just general overview of Foucault and his relationship to the left. And hopefully that'll give you a good framework to dive into the actual lectures themselves. All right, Comrade Commissar Don, would you like to inaugurate the send-off into the lectures themselves?
Sure. I think we can start by saying, I don't know how you feel, but I think the first couple pages are not terribly useful. I think he's just talking to his audience about getting the lecture series started, essentially.
That's true. It's mostly logistics about when class times are going to be.
Right.
Yeah, I appreciate the fidelity to the lecture of saying, let's really publish this in full, but it's like, come on, I don't need to fucking read about what time they were going to do. I think he has a quote where he says, well, we're going to move it to 10 instead of 9 because none of you assholes can get up early enough.
Well, I think he says he intentionally starts it at 9 because he wants less people to attend, right?
What an asshole.
And he says like this is like not a great way of like figuring out which student or like deciding which students are going to be there, but it's better than just about anything else too. So it says, you might say that it's not a very fair selection criteria. Those who get up and those who don't get up, it's as good as any.
In some ways, I think that's a really kind of radical political move that Foucault's making. For all the shit talking about how he's so disconnected from materialist practice, that is just straight up a fucking like authoritarian materialist practice. Yeah. So, gotta admire that.
Yeah. So, I think it usefully starts on maybe the very bottom of page 6, or maybe middle of 6 or something like that.
And just for the readers, which I would say we both really encourage them to read at least some of these lectures. They're like 15, 20 pages a piece?
Yes.
And they're transcripts from the lectures, so they're very readable.
Yeah. Definitely think you should read them, but also we're hoping that the series can be listened to by people who don't read it. So it's not required reading, but recommended.
Yeah, it would just be if you like this and you want to get even more into it. I would just say my main recommendation is if you're interested in Foucault, like read the lecture series.
Yeah.
Almost like more than the actual books.
I would agree with that as well.
Okay, well, you said it starts on the bottom of page 6, so why don't you grab something and let's start from there.
So I was going to start at the very top of 7. Let me see. Because I think he wants to say that he's going to talk about subjugated knowledges. And he says he means two things when he talks about subjugated knowledges. On the one hand, I am referring to historical contents that have been buried or masked in functional coherences or formal systemizations. And then a little bit later, the second part of the subjugated knowledges. When I say subjugated knowledges, I'm also referring to the whole series of knowledges that have been disqualified as non-conceptual knowledges, as insufficiently elaborated knowledges, naive knowledges, hierarchical inferior knowledges, knowledges that are below the required level of erudition or scientificity. Okay, yeah, you get the idea of that word.
He does a lot of taking a word and then putting like ity at the end of it.
Yeah.
It's like a thing of Foucault's. Well, I think that's an interesting place to start. So kind of like what we mentioned in the general overview of Foucault, he's really interested in the way that there are different forms of knowledge, different, let's say, discourses, ways of using language to be able to say what is true and what isn't. And we always have this idea that there's usually one way to do that, and it's through, let's say, like the scientific method or something. And he's basically saying, there are always different subjugated knowledges which don't have primacy in society. And I think what's really interesting, maybe we can think about this in relation to a lot of the left now. I think this is a really, really common thing that we're doing, trying to say we need to rescue the sort of particular experiences or subjective histories of like different peoples, like histories from below. I think which in a way is sort of part of this, whether he would have said it was or not. This is something similar to what Foucault is interested in.
Would you say that Foucault in a way helps to start off
Yeah, I was actually thinking, I was trying to remember when People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn was published. And I don't know when, but in my experience, I think especially in a lot of like more anthropological, sociological, academic work, I think that Foucault is sort of the primary influence here.
Okay.
Yeah.
To me, the second group of subjugated knowledges that he talks about, I think is like pretty clear. It seems to be the people and the knowledge of those types of people that were excluded from general histories, which he seems to, I think he's essentially describing a lot of his former work. I was a little bit less clear on the first one, like the historical contents that have been buried or masked in functional coherences or formal systemizations. Would that essentially just be, things like evidence in histories that have been written or historical records that essentially just don't fit into the contemporary narrative and so therefore are ignored or something like that?
Yeah, I was actually thinking of, this is like very far afield from maybe leftist politics, but I was thinking of Thomas Kuhn's work on the structure of scientific revolutions, how there are like particular theories of, let's say at a particular time, like atoms, right? What we now know is at least, sort of this idea of what are the basic building blocks of like material reality. And Thomas Kuhn has this interesting sort of description of how there were actually a lot of competing theories on what those should be, how we should think about them. And so one of them eventually won out. These other ones were, sort of marginalized. I don't know. Would you think of something like that as subjugated? In kind of Foucault's sense?
Because he seems to say that they've just essentially been buried, or forgotten, I think. So, I would say that's a fair description.
Well, I'm looking on page 8 here, and I guess one of the quotes that really stuck out to me was whenever he's talking about buried scholarly knowledge and knowledges that were disqualified by the hierarchy of erudition and sciences, that actually gave the discursive critique of the last 15 years its essential strength. I think he's kind of describing that, but what really jumps out at me is he says that what we're really kind of looking at is a historical knowledge of struggles. And I think that to me is sort of the core of this first lecture, which is to say, we're going to understand different categories, different forms of knowledge, different institutions in society as not necessarily like existing sort of in abstract, and then those basically create divisions within society, but that there are divisions and struggles within society, and seeing sort of almost like the base as being this almost kind of war or struggle within society. And then we're going to look at different institutions and different ways of thinking about knowledge and powers emerging out of that.
Yeah, and I think the next section, which I think you touched on a little bit in the last episode, is essentially where he talks about his relation to this idea of like science. And he kind of understands this, as we talked about last week again, these genealogies as being what he says unscientific, actually. Talking about the genealogical project, he says, it is a way of playing local, discontinuous, disqualified, or non-legitimized knowledges off against the unitary theoretical instance that claims to be able to filter them, organize them into a hierarchy, organize them into the name of a true body of knowledge, in the name of the rights of a science that is in the hands of the few. Genealogies are therefore not positivistic returns to a form of science that is more attentive or more accurate. Genealogies are, quite specifically, anti-sciences.
Yeah, and actually, a little bit before that, a really interesting thing, too. He says, these genealogies are a combination of erudite knowledge and what people know. They would not have been possible, they could not have even been attempted, were it not for one thing, the removal of the tyranny of overall discourses with their hierarchies and all the privileges enjoyed by theoretical vanguards. And I really love that he uses the phrase theoretical vanguards, because it's this very interesting kind of like throwing shade at Marxism a little bit, like traditional orthodox Marxism, but also saying that it is precisely this claim to being scientific and objective, and you decide which discourses are valid and which ones aren't, how they get incorporated and sort of put into a hierarchy, that in itself is that creates the necessity of some sort of theoretical vanguard, even in things like the sciences and in knowledge, and these things that we think are sort of abstracted from power and abstracted from these more like material political sorts of like functions and aspects. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about sort of his relationship to still in some ways, I think it's actually a pretty effective use of the idea of a vanguard to think about that in terms of something like scientific knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, one question, and I think he kind of touches on it or at least hints at it in this section. But I guess I have a little bit of difficulty of knowing, like, once these genealogies are talked about and spoken of, he seems to, at least my sense is to he doesn't want them to then be incorporated into like a larger narrative. I mean, do you think that, I guess it's hard for me to think of an attempt at history that doesn't seek to incorporate all these different aspects of history. And so is it unreasonable of him to think that there's maybe not a form of history that can at least incorporate all of these? Are these genealogies just always going to exist alongside histories? Is there a point in which like does he wish for all narrative history to essentially, be surpassed by these genealogies?
I'm not sure. I've always, in my readings of Foucault, I've always gathered that he has a very complex relationship to his history and historians. And I think a lot of historians criticize Foucault for doing like really shitty history.
Yeah, I don't think his reputation is great.
Yeah, it's not very good. It's not very good. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to think, is he trying to utilize the genealogy itself as a way to subvert and sort of disrupt power? One of the things that Foucault always described about power is he thinks of it functioning in a very almost like it functions through spaces. The way that he describes power at its core is not like something that someone holds, and I think we're going to get to this a little bit.
We'll get to this actually.
Yeah, but it's something that's more of like a network of these ways of interrelating to different individuals through these sort of like things of language and institutions. So I think with this, he always seemed to say that power is sort of weakest at the margins. And I think this is maybe where that idea of like marginality gains so much traction. So I would wonder if his whole approach is to say a genealogy is something that kind of exists at the periphery of institutional like forms of knowledge like history and discourse. And maybe the idea would be that, it's going to sort of exist out here at the margin, and it's kind of related to it. It's using it in a way, but it's using it in a way to be ultimately subversive in some sort of sense.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's like helpful.
Was that helpful, or was that just me like bullshitting my way through it?
I mean, that's helpful. I guess I still, to me, it's like difficult to imagine being able to, like, especially for someone who is as influential as Foucault, to talk about these things and to not have some form of these genealogies then turn into a form of like a history or something like that. Like once we talk about them, once he writes a book about them and they're like enormously influential, are they really existing at the margins anymore? Or
I mean, absolutely not. Like Foucault is dominant in the academy, right? Yeah. I remember I went to a grocery store one day and I was going to read for a few minutes in between like work stuff. And I had actually a copy of The Order of Things, which, at the time was, I mean, it's this horribly hard to read book and it's incredibly long and it's really dry. And, it was a bestseller whenever it came out in France, which is just sort of wild to think about. I mean, that would be like some like weird ass, like object-oriented ontology or something becoming like a New York Times bestseller. Or something like that. But I remember I was holding this book and the person checking me out saw it and they had this look on their face and they looked really upset and they were just staring at my book. And I was like, oh, do you like philosophy? And they were like, is that Michel Foucault? And I was like, oh shit, yeah, it's Michel Foucault. And they were like, I took one philosophy class in college and the professor basically just took us through the whole semester and we read Foucault line by line. Jeez. I was like, that is the worst way to teach philosophy to anybody. But, I mean, I think, and maybe in particular departments, maybe at different times, I think he did become very dominant in the academy. So
yeah, I remember in my experience, at least in the department I was in, it wasn't, he was talked about, but he wasn't really dominant. But when I would talk to people in like anthropology and stuff like that, he was like incredibly dominant in anthropology.
Well, something else that I'd be curious what you think about this. We mentioned this in the introductory episode. I think one of the criticisms that gets leveled at Foucault, there's been a couple of books that have come out recently about this, is did he really underestimate the period of capitalism and neoliberal functions of like discourse and language in society that he found himself in? And is a lot of what he advocated for this sort of like fashioning of a subject that can resist power, the way that he thinks about discourses and genealogies, like in the end, did he really just sort of have these kind of assumptions that were really kind of based in a lot of the neoliberal sort of late capitalist forces and changes that were happening at the time that even he didn't realize? And that's part of why he's been able to be incorporated so easily into, the academy and even to a lot of like, I think, like activist and like political discourse in a lot of ways now. I mean, whenever you read Foucault, do you ever get the sense that there's this maybe even like kind of slightly anarchist, I don't know, sort of neoliberal kind of focus on like the individual and the subject?
Yeah, actually, I don't know. I think like we talked about last week, I can see how he's can be contrasted with like a sort of Marxist analysis to some degree. And I also know that I don't quite understand it too much, but I know that there was quite a bit of contention between him and like Sartre, right, over issues of like subjectivity and things like that.
I think also him and Merleau-Ponty as well, and
so in some ways it feels like he attempts to maybe sidestep subjectivity in some ways, but he still definitely seems to, I guess, place some form of individuality as like central. I guess, I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Actually, I think the idea that because he had this sort of criticism of moving away from quote unquote orthodox Marxism, that maybe it's really easy to read him as in some way supporting or being kind of a philosopher of this sort of neoliberal era. But yeah, maybe how much is that actually not a very good reading or understanding of him? Because I mean, he's very complicated, and I think it's easy to misread him. But yeah, maybe that's actually much more of what the reaction is this idea that, oh, he's moving away from orthodox Marxism and he's not leveling a very straightforward, very visible critique of capitalism writ large. So, maybe he actually fits into this much more like neoliberal, like atomized individual subjectivity sort of focus. Yeah. Well, at the bottom of 9, just to kind of reemphasize this criticism of the scientific sort of method in relation to Marxism, he says, genealogies or genealogists' answer to the question, is it a science or not, is turning Marxism or psychoanalysis or wherever else it is into a science is precisely what we are criticizing you for. And if there is one objection to be made against Marxism, it's that it might well be a science. To put it in more, if not more sophisticated terms, at least milder terms, let me say this. even before we know to what extent something like Marxism or psychoanalysis is analogous to a scientific practice in its day-to-day operations and its rules of construction and the concepts it uses, we should be asking ourselves about the aspiration to power that is inherent in the claim to being a science. So for me, that really stuck out. And I actually was thinking a lot about Althusser here. I was like, he's basically just talking mad shit about Althusser. And that was essentially Althusser's really, I think, like core project, was to really help shape Marxist analysis and critique into a really objective science. Yeah, that didn't require like sort of the ideological human subject, like this sort of human focus that a lot of existentialists like humanist Marxism would sort of take the tack of. Do you want to, I'm being really biased here, but do you want to touch on 13? He starts to critique what he calls the economism in a theory of power about Marxism, where he says it's like a commodity. Yeah,
so I guess this is where he talks about, I guess, this older idea of power, right? On 13, where he says, quote, "In this case, the classical juridical theory of power is regarded as a right which can be possessed in the way one possesses a commodity, and which can therefore be transferred or alienated, either completely or partly, through a juridical act or an act that founds a right. It does not matter which, for the moment, thanks to the surrender of something or thanks to a contract," end quote. So I think that's where he kind of wants to criticize this idea of power being a thing that's just held, like it's held in, by a king or by a judge or something like that, and wants to talk about power in a much more complex form of where power is something that is exercised and not just can be held and can be transferred from easily from one person to another.
Yeah, and the idea that power in that way is in some ways replicating the logic of a commodity.
Yes,
and that
exactly.
There's sort of an analogy between power and commodities, and he says between power and wealth. So the idea that, these are things that one individual person holds that can be transferred, and if I can also own something, again, kind of using kind of the Marxist critique and turning it back on itself to say the same way you can be alienated from the production of commodities through your labor, you can also be alienated from the holding of power in some way. Yeah, but I think it's kind of a really ingenious way to push sort of the Marxist critique of commodity production and alienation even further, to say, how do we kind of use that logic to think about something as weirdly intangible as power itself?
I don't know if this is too much of a digression, but I think of something like the Stanford prison experiments, where I feel like that's, when I look at the violence that was done by the people who were quote unquote in power, I think what it seems like where a lot of that came from was not necessarily just the power that they had, but the feelings that those people had of not actually possessing, or that fear of not actually possessing that power or something like that. And so, to me, it was there's power is not just something that can be held. These people were given power, but it was specifically this feeling that they didn't actually possess it or something like that I think caused the the really terrible repercussions and stuff like that. So
would you describe the guards in that experiment as sort of almost being kind of conduits for power to work through them or flow through them in a certain kind of way, versus I have these sunglasses, these mirrored sunglasses and this baton, and those are the things that give me power themselves?
It's hard for me to think of it like that. Can you talk about how are you thinking of it?
Well, I'm actually thinking of Foucault's sort of definition of power in this respect, that power is something that works on this level of what we kind of mentioned, what he calls microphysics, that it's not these large sort of brutal kind of displays. It's something that functions in this very subtle interpersonal way, and that power is like a network. It's not something that one person holds. It takes a whole network of different subjective positions for power to function in a way. So for example, what gave those guards power was the fact that there were prisoners in which to exercise that power upon. And they also had to be sort of contextualized within an institution and within a scientific experiment that gave them the feeling of, we're participating in an objective process of scientific discovery through doing this. And it's almost like you can look at the guards themselves individually and their own personalities and wonder about why they were able to exercise the power in the way that they did. But I think Foucault would actually say, no, it's kind of this whole, what he would almost call a constellation of subjects and discursive rules and this sort of validation through science that allowed it to function in the way that it did.
Yeah, I guess when you were like just that it's like a conduit for power to function or something like that. I don't know. I just got some object-oriented ontology or something like that. Of
Please say more. Please say more about it. No. It's like literally we're saying that the guards like turned into like outlets, like wall sockets.
Oh no, yeah. We can cut that
part. Well, I guess thinking about the Stanford prison experiment, whenever we think about Foucault's idea of power, do you find that to kind of be a helpful way to think through like why the results were what they were?
Yeah. I guess that's kind of what I was trying was like, I see the guards as they're essentially given a position of power, in which case they feel like they should have some authority or something like that, right? That they feel like that they've been given it, and so therefore they have it. But when they interacted with the prisoners, and the prisoners didn't necessarily respond or like respect that power in some ways, it made them realize that like, they don't actually like have power, and
that's true.
That there's like a fear of losing that power, or feeling almost like emasculated by not being able to exercise that power, that then made them like, I think much more like vindictive and violent and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm actually reminded of Hannah Arendt's distinction between violence and power here. Yeah. The idea that violence is precisely what functions whenever one has an absence of power. That ability to make people do things against their own will, and violence functions whenever you don't have that ability over people. Yeah.
I guess I was just thought of that because when you were talking about this like idea of like alienation and power, that to me was of this, we can maybe think of being alienated from even like one's own thought of of power that they have or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I'm sure we're probably going to come back to that. I feel like that's a really good sort of like concrete example to think through. Okay, like what does Foucault mean whenever he talks about power in this particular way?
So I think in continuing his discussion of like what power is, or how to understand power, on 15, he kind of talks about two immediate answers maybe to what power is. Near the top of the page, we have what I would call an off-the-cuff answer, or at least an immediate response, and it seems to me that this is ultimately the answer given by the concrete reality of many contemporary analyses. Power is essentially that which represses. Power is that which represses nature, instincts, a class, or individuals.
Ooh, interesting that he says a class there.
Yeah. But then later he goes on and he says, next paragraph, a second hypothesis. Power is war, the continuation of war by other means. At this point, we can invert Clausewitz's proposition and say that politics is the continuation of war by other means. And so he kind of gives these two possible answers to how we understand power, and not to give any spoilers for the rest of the chapter. Which
no spoilers.
Only a page or two, but he's going to want to say that he's unhappy with this description of repression as power, and wants to move towards this idea of power being understood as war. And that would bring us to, I would say, the major point of at least the first few lectures, right?
Well, on this note of Clausewitz, one thing that he says this implies, it implies three things. First, that power relations, as they function in a society like ours, are essentially anchored in a certain relationship of force that was established in and through war at a given historical moment, which you can historically specify.
So I did want to read this quote from the top of 16.
Do it.
So continuing his explanation of what he means by inverting Clausewitz's aphorism.
I mean Clausewitz?
There you go. Thank you. you can just cut that and like insert it in every time somebody says Clausewitz. He says politics, in other words, sanctions and reproduces the disequilibrium of forces manifested in war. Inverting the proposition also means something else, namely that within this, quote, civil peace, end quote, these political struggles, these clashes over or with power, these modifications of relations of force, the shifting balance, the reversals, in a political system, all these things must be interpreted as a continuation of war.
Yeah, I remember finding that really fascinating the first time I read this, and the idea that essentially, these different episodes, what he says, fragmentations, displacements of the war itself. So whenever we kind of are looking at things like civil society and all these aspects, we're really just seeing kind of the sort of like the refraction of this sort of initial sort of historical specific period of war, or how that developed and how that sort of gets shifted into civil society and institutions.
Yeah. And I think that this, because he kind of ends the chapter by basically just saying, like, this is what he's going to talk about in the next few lectures.
Mm-hmm. He says that inverting Clausewitz's aphorism also has a third meaning. The final decision can only come from war, or in other words, a trial by strength in which weapons are the final judges. It means that the last battle would put an end to politics, or in other words, that the last battle would at last, and I mean at last being in quotations, suspend the exercise of power as continuous warfare.
I feel like this idea, which I'm not sure if it was influenced necessarily by Foucault or not, but I feel like this idea of, I guess, politics as, maybe not necessarily as war, using the language of war, but definitely as like just struggle and conflict of one group or another, seems to have become increasingly popular in the last couple of years. I feel like
so too, yeah.
Definitely when I was younger, that there's an idea of politics as cooperation, of finding a compromises and stuff like that. I think was like much more popular to understand like what politics was doing. And I think you and I had a discussion like several years ago where we kind of talked about how it felt like until the last couple years that politics was essentially just an argument over different technocrats or something like that.
Yeah.
But now it feels like there has like returned to be a genuine struggle of different groups, different classes, even like vying for power. And I think this idea of politics as struggle has seemed to return a little bit more.
I think so too. And I do think that part of that younger period, maybe for both of us, when it seemed that politics was much more discussion about navigating different needs and interests through compromise, is something that was very strongly related to the end of history of Francis Fukuyama, and the idea that thinking of actually our two episodes on left-wing melancholia, the fall of the Soviet Union, there is no other challenge to, I guess, like liberal democratic capitalism. So the only thing left to do is to navigate through discourse and through these civil institutions. And then 9/11 happens, the war on terror happens, and all of a sudden we now see that history, the engine of history, is restarted, and now that there is struggle, and we maybe at least, I think that it was always there, but the idea would be that it was sort of subdued, and the way that we think about politics, it just wasn't part of the conversation as much.
Yeah. So I guess if you would have, if I would have thought about it, and you would have asked me the question from last episode of why did we pick this book, this probably would have been a really good answer, but
that's all right.
I didn't think of it. So, but yeah, this.
I mean, we got it now. I think that's exactly right, though.
Yeah. So, but yeah, he ends the chapter with basically saying that in the next two lectures, one, he's going to talk about why this idea of repression is not sufficient for him for an idea of power, and then after that, he'll talk about why he thinks war is a, I guess, more effective way of talking about this idea of politics. And he will use the language of warfare, of strategy and tactics and conflict and stuff like that going forward.
Yeah. Well, lots of really good, interesting stuff. And I think whenever we get to the final lecture, one or two, especially for Marxist, I think we're going to have some pretty, I would say, fairly shocking and pretty challenging conclusions to draw from Foucault's lectures.
Yeah, on that cliffhanger, I think we could probably end the episode.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a cliffhanger. It's going to be like 20 episodes before we get to that one. Just hang in there, I promise. But yeah, so I guess we'll see y'all back for the next part of the mini-series, the mini-squared series on Michel Foucault, Society Must Be Defended.
Take care, y'all.
Yeah, peace. That is a wrap, officially, on Lecture 1 of Society Must Be Defended by Michel Foucault. If this was your first exposure to some of Michel Foucault's work, Comrade Commissar Don and I really hope you enjoyed this very brief snippet and some of his actual writing and wording and description of his different theorizing of concepts like power, his very unique combination of history, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, and you got a little bit of an idea of what that's going to look like for the rest of the mini-series. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, this Michel Foucault stuff, all this postmodern neo-Marxism garbage, that's fine for maybe a week or two, but don't tell me that you're going to be doing all of these lectures right in a row, all 20 or 25 of them, whatever it might be. Well, dear listener, fear not, because next week, we're going to have some new blood up here in the library, and we're going to be tackling something that will be a bit more in the historical and Marxist-Leninist vein. We're going to be reading Anatomy of a War, Vietnam, the United States, and the Modern Historical Experience by the Canadian historian Gabriel Kolko. And joining me on that episode is going to be a very dear comrade and a new participant on the show, Comrade Jordan. He bravely chose to read a 600-page history book in a little over a week and is going to come on, and we're going to do our best to tear through that material to make it understandable, to make it relevant to you. We're going to tackle all sorts of things, such as anti-imperialism by the Vietnamese Communist Party against the French and the United States, the role of the Marxist-Leninist Party in the anti-imperialist struggle during Vietnam, and all sorts of other historical details that I think will be very relevant and interesting for all sorts of different folks out there who are curious about anti-imperialism, the role of Marxist-Leninist style parties, some of their strengths, and also some of their weaknesses and limitations. And Jordan and I definitely conclude that a thorough study of the situation in Vietnam, the revolution there, the anti-imperialist insurgency is perhaps one of the most enlightening places to study to answer some of those questions that we still ask ourselves today on the left. So join us back here for that, and as always in the meantime, subscribe on iTunes, give us one of those quick reviews to help others find the show, support us on Patreon, help us get up to 25 patrons, and we'll see you back here next week on Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. Peace.